As promised, in this one, we're going to be testing our reducers, and the reducers are just functions. We pass in various things, we expect various things to come out. So we can crack open the filters file, for example, the filters reducer in here. All we're going to do is call this function with different values. We're going to pass in some state, we're going to pass in action, and we're going to make sure the action has the correct impact on the state by making an assertion about what comes back. So to kick off this process, we do need to create a file. This one is in the source reducers folder, so we have to make a file in the tests reducers folder. The reducers folder needs to come first. Then we can create the test file. For this one, that would be filters.test.js. This is where we are going to add every single test case for the filters reducer. Let's get started by importing the filters reducer, and I'm going to grab that from going up to folders, going into the reducers folder, and right there, this one is for filters. So now that we have the import in place, we can start adding some test cases. The first test case that we're going to go through, and we'll go through a few together, is going to be the one that makes sure the default values get set up correctly when the Redux store first kicks off. Now, Redux dispatches a special action for that, and we can actually see that. So if we shut down the test suite and run npm run dev server, we can take a look at the Redux developer tools and see exactly what's happening. The server is up. I'm going to switch over to the browser, give the page a refresh, and we're just going to head into the Redux developer tools. And if we do, we can see there are a few various actions. We have the add expense ones coming from app.js, and then we have this guy, at init. If you take a look at the action object, it is just a single property type set equal to at init. There is nothing else on there. And this is what we're going to be dispatching to test the defaults. So this is used internally by Redux. We're never going to actually respond to this inside of our reducers or dispatch it on our own, but we can use it in our test cases to make sure that the reducer sets itself up correctly. So over in the terminal, I am going to shut down the dev server, switch back over to the test suite, and then from there, we'll add our very first test case. Over here, test. In this case, we can say should set up default filter values. Then we can go ahead and actually create the arrow function for the test. And now it's time to set up the call to the reducer. Right here, I'm going to create a const state for the value that comes back. Then I'm going to call filters reducer, passing in the necessary arguments. The first one is the current state. The whole point of this is to test the defaults. So we're going to pass nothing in for that, undefined. And the second one is going to be our action object. And we just explored that the first one that Redux dispatches is just a simple object with a type value equal to the string at uppercase init. So in the end of the day, what we're going to do is expect something about the state. So we are going to expect the state to equal, and then we are going to go ahead and actually set up the object that we're hoping comes back. And a couple of these are going to be easy. So for example, text, empty string, nothing hard there. Next up would be sort by. Sort by should be date by default. Then we have start date and end date. And those are actually moment instances at the start of the month and the end of the month. So we could go ahead and just create those over here. I'm going to import moment from moment. Then I'm going to set it up. So start date should be moment from the current point in time. And then we're going to use dot start of to go to the start of. In this case, we're trying to go to the start of the month. And then finally end date. So for end date, what are we trying to do? We are trying to create a moment from the current point in time and go to the end of the month. Excellent. Now, if we go ahead and save the filters test file, we should no longer see that error, and we should see our entire test suite passing, and that is indeed the case. Next up, we can go ahead and start testing some of the individual cases the reducer is supposed to handle. We're going to focus on these two together, and the rest will be yours to work through. So first up, sort by amount. We want to make sure that when we dispatch this action, sort by actually changes over to amount, and we can get that done with a brand new test case. Test should set sort by to amount. We can then set up the actual function for the test case, and we can kick things off by creating a const for the state. Now, once again, we're going to go ahead and simply call the reducer, filters reducer, and we're going to pass in the correct info. So we can keep the state at undefined, and then we're going to define our action object. Now in this case, we just need an object with a type value set equal to, and it's sort by amount. Now that we have this in place, we can actually make an assertion about what should have come back. Right here, we can get that done. I'm going to expect the state dot sort by value to be, and right here, we're going to expect it to be lowercase a amount. Now we can go ahead and save that filters test file. We have 17 passing tests. We're just going to knock out one more together, and that is going to be for sort by date. So it's going to be pretty similar, but also a little different because the default value is already date. So to make sure things actually change, we're going to pass in a state to the reducer. So let's go ahead and play around with that. Test should set, instead of sort by to amount, it will be sort by to date. Then we're going to go ahead and set up our function. Now in here, we're going to be defining a few things, and I'm actually going to break them out into their own variables. So the first thing we're going to define is going to be the default state. So what are we passing into the reducer? What is the current state value? Right here, const current state. We're going to set this equal to an object, and we're going to define the state before we call the reducer. Then we're also going to define the action. So what type of action are we going to be dispatching? In this case, it just has a type of sort by date, and then we're actually going to pass everything into the reducer. So down below, how would we do that? We would create a const called state. We would call the filters reducer function, and we'd pass in the information. We'd pass in the current state, we would pass in the action, and then we can make an assertion about what comes back. Now we do need to define the current state. So what is the current state going to be? Well, over inside of the filters reducer, we already know that we're not going to be providing the default value because we are going to be setting our own. So all we have to do is pick something that makes sense for this test case. We don't really care about the text, so we can leave that at whatever we want. We also don't really care about start date or end date. Start date could be something like undefined. We could do the exact same thing for end date. The only thing we actually care about is the only thing we haven't provided, which is sort by. So I want to make sure to start sort by off at amount so we can actually watch it change. If it's already date, we're not going to actually be confirming that dispatching this action has any effect on the Redux store. Now though, we would expect the amount to change over to date, and we can make an assertion to that effect. So we can expect that the state value, state dot sort by, equals, using to-be, since we're not comparing arrays or objects, there's no need for to equal, and we are going to expect it right here to be the lowercase string date. Now we can go ahead and actually save the file. We should see we have 18 passing tests, and that is exactly what we have. So if the reducer wasn't working as expected, we would be notified. This also gives us the freedom to refactor the reducer to improve it or increase its speed without worrying about breaking the functionality, because in the end of the day, everything we care about has already been outlined in a test. Now there are a few more test cases that need to get created, and you're going to do those down below. First up, we're going to have should set text filter. That's going to make sure that when we do dispatch that action with the correct data, the actual filter text gets set. Then we're going to go ahead and do the exact same thing for start date and end date. So should set start date filter, and then finally should set end date filter. So we've already taken care of sort by and the default up above. All you need to do is create and fill out these 3 test cases using the exact same logic we used up above. So for neither of these, do you need to provide a value for the first argument to filters reducer? You can just use undefined like we did here. Then you dispatch the correct action with the necessary data, and you make sure it was actually set on the state that comes back. So take some time to knock that one out. By the time you're done, you should have 21 passing test cases, up from the current 18 passing test cases. Pause the video, knock that one out, and when you're done, click play. All right, let's go ahead and knock this out, starting with the text filter one. So right here, test, passing in the name, setting up the arrow function. What is the name for this one? Should set text filter. What do we want to do? We want to make sure the text filter actually gets set. So what I'm going to do is start off by defining the text value, const text. Then I am going to set it equal to the filter value I'm going to use. This is my filter. Now you didn't have to do this. You might have just had this string two places in your test case. Either way works, but it's a good idea to break this out into its own variable. Now from here, we can go ahead and actually set up the action. Once again, you didn't necessarily need to explicitly create an action object, but we are going to be setting the type here. Now, what is the type that we're looking to handle? It is set text filter. What are we looking to pass in that action object? In this case, we just need to pass down the text value. So I will set text equal to text using the ES6 shorthand. Now that we have the action object all set up, we can go ahead and actually call the reducer. So I can create a const called state. I can call the filters reducer. I can pass in undefined for the current state. I can pass in my action object for the new action we're dispatching. All I need to do from here is actually check the values that come back. I'm going to expect state.text to be the text variable from up above. The new value on text should be whatever I passed in to the action object. And if I go ahead and save the test case, we now have 19 passing tests. So we can move on to the next one, should set start date filter. I'm going to go ahead and remove the comment up above and create the test case for that one. Test should set start date filter. And while I'm at it, I'll create the test function for the other one. I can just take this, copy it, and paste it down below. Should set end date filter. And now we can go through the process of actually filling these out. Right here, the flow is going to be very similar. Start date is going to be the variable that we create. And we already have moment imported, so we can just use it. I am going to create a moment right here. Then I'm going to go ahead and create the action object that I want to dispatch. We have a type for this one. The type is set start date. And we also have to provide the start date. I already created a variable to that effect, so we can toss that on right here. Now that we have the action object created, we have to create the const for the state. We have to call the reducer with the necessary arguments, the first one being undefined, and the second one being the action object that we just defined. Now, all we have to do is use a little bit of expect. So right here, I'm going to expect the following. I'm going to expect state dot start date. This time around, I'm going to use two equals since we're comparing moment instances, which are objects, and I'm going to check that it equals the start date variable from up above. Now, if we go ahead and save things, we should have another passing test case, and we do. Just one more left to go. It's actually very similar to this one, so I can go ahead and copy that and paste it down below. All we really need to do is change a few things. So to kick things off, we no longer have start date. We're going to have end date, so I'll change that here. Then we no longer have set start date. We have set capital end date. I'm going to make sure to swap out the variable name here. And then we just have one more usage right here. End date. And finally, we're looking at the end date property on the state that comes back. Now that we have those changes in place, we have the new test case set up. I can remove the challenge comments, save the file, and we can see that we have 21 passing tests. So at this point, we've made assertions about almost everything aside from our components and a single reducer. In the next video, we're going to wrap up that final reducer. Then we'll spend the rest of the section learning how we can test React. I'm excited to get to all of that. So let's continue on in the next one.